Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my podcast partner, Tom Laidlaw, the former NHL defenseman. You remember him from the New York Rangers and Los Angeles Kings. And this is the Laidlaw and Allen Report. We like to come and talk all things hockey twice a week. But you would think, Tom, that we were going to run out of things. But, there is kind of newsy stuff going on. And yesterday, there was a lot of talk about the meeting that general managers had with the league office where they extended the quarantine, and it was kind of wishful thinking. I think it was a week or 10 days, which takes us into April. But I think everyone believes that it'll be much later than that if we have hockey. But there was sort of a kind of a hopeful tone because the league has asked the arenas to come up with dates in August where they could play. So maybe what we're thinking here, Tom, is that, if we can get to the peak of this some point in May and then start down, that maybe we could get in July. And we've talked about this before, a training camp in July, and then maybe games in, August and early September with, everything being sort of up in the air with regard to what the tournament would look like.
Sure. Yeah, like we talked before too. I guess there's just so much that's unknown because you've never been through this before in the past, and we've talked the comparison to the old days when I started, where training camps were meant for the older players really to get in shape. They didn't do a whole lot. When I first started, they didn't do a whole lot of training. Guys like Phil Esposito and Steve Vickers or Walt Kachuk, when I first started, I thought I was this fantastic athlete because I come into training camp, I'm in great shape, and they were out of shape. But it wasn't that they wouldn't. That was just the way it was done back then. They would rest during the summer. The idea was they'd rest their body, have a longer training camp, have 2-a-days, more games, and then they were ready for the National Hockey League season. So now with these players the way they are, training camps usually they may skate for a couple of days and then they're playing exhibition games right away. Now that I'm assuming is going to change with these guys. They are very dedicated athletes. They take care of themselves, but they don't have the training facilities they're used to. They can still do some things, and I'm sure they are. But I mean, to me, you have to be looking at a minimum of 2 weeks of training camp before they can step in and play. And even then, the fear is going to be, for me, if I'm a coach or an owner of a team or a general manager, I'm looking at saying, the risk of injury to players, those smaller injuries, the groin injuries and things like that, because you just have been away from the game for so long and away from training for so long, it's just to jump right in and play meaningful games. It's going to be tough. I can just about guarantee, I hate to say it, but there's going to be some of those injuries when we come back and play.
Yeah, and I've had athletes tell me that, hockey players, that if they don't skate for a couple of days, they feel like, they're a little bit out of shape. I mean, that's how finely tuned they are.
Yeah, no question. If we had some days off, and I remember even having one day off, it's just that first little while, that first 15 or 20 minutes of skating, it was like, you're skating in cement, or something. So it's, but I guess, listen, it is what it is. It's going to be the same thing for everybody. The league, I think, has done such a fantastic job of making sure that the product that they put on the ice is so good right now. So I think I feel confident they're going to do the same thing here. But again, there's just so much unknown. To me, it's the unknown with these players now. This time off at this time of the year that they're not used to. That's the part to me that I'd be a little bit worried about. And again, the concern, they have to play, but the concern is those injuries. And again, most of the injuries I'm talking about are short-term nagging injuries. They're not those. I don't think you increase your chances of, blowing out a knee or backs or something like that. I think it's just more of those groins and everything. But the flip side is, we talked about before, when we had the last lockout, it was only a 48-game schedule, and you just played again all the games in your own conference. And that was some exciting hockey. So that's when you assume whatever system they come up with, that's going to be the same kind of scenario.
Now, would this be easier on, say, a younger player like Cale Makar versus, kind of an older, player in his 30s?
You know what? I think the older guys now know so much more about conditioning and diet. I would think that they may have a better handle on it. They may be the guys more that have access to more training equipment and would be more diligent. And again, I don't want to paint the picture that the young guys wouldn't, but I mean, I just think the part of the being a professional athlete now, particularly a hockey player, as you get older, these guys are like businesses within themselves, right? They're multi-million-dollar businesses, really. So they have these personal trainers and all the equipment that they use. So I think that the older guys probably would have a better handle on their conditioning than the younger players.
Yeah. Well, it's almost reached the point, I think, in this business, Tom, and you just said it, everybody sort of views themselves as their own little mini corporation.
Yeah.
But, like everybody understands that part of being an NHL player is you got to be in condition
Yes.
All year round. And even though I think it's probably more difficult now because everyone's sequestered in their homes, and I'm sure they have some training apparatus, but they probably don't have everything they'd love to have.
Totally.
And in this case, probably wouldn't you think the older players whose homesteads are more established would have more
home gym.
equipment?
Yeah, I don't think they'd have a home gym, right? They got families at home.
Yeah.
I mean, they still would have to go to a gym during a regular off season to work out, but they would probably try to stay home as much as possible during the season. They're traveling so much, so you would think that during the summer when they're training, they want to be home as much as possible, so they would have more of a home gym. I'm trying to think back to the old days when we were playing. If we had to go through this, I don't know what our conditioning level would be. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, well, and nowadays they have artificial ice. I wonder if any older players actually have any artificial, ice that they could work with. I mean, I really don't have any idea. Speaking of ice, that's one of the issues as well. If we're going to play in July and August, we're not accustomed to having to deal with arena issues and heat issues in those 2 months. Now we see it in June, and with the modern arenas, I think it's less of a problem. But some of these arenas are a little bit older. Tom, can you explain the difference between what the ice is like when the temperature outside is in the 80s and the humidity is high?
Yeah, it's the humidity, right? So the ice would get a lot softer. So I mean, there's a lot of times if we play with the Rangers at Madison Square Garden, no matter what time of the year it was, they would have multiple events in one given day. They may have a basketball game in the afternoon and a hockey game at night. So they're putting the boards over top of the ice and then they're taking them off again. And you're dealing with the issues. So the humid days, you've got doors open inside the building, the humidity is coming in. You hit the nail on the head. I think the new buildings won't have a problem with it, but some of the older buildings, and you start talking about places like Dallas and everything where the humidity is higher, I do think it could be an issue. The ice just gets really soft, breaks up easier, the puck bounces more. I mean, it's funny for a guy like me. I love that. I love when the ice is bad because I kind of even the playing field. It's easier for me to check guys. But again, I think all these buildings, I think they'll do a pretty job. And maybe some of those places, the Floridas and Tampas and places like that where the humidity is higher. But there's going to be a lot of there's so much of the unknown, right? And you hit the nail on the head. You start thinking about things. The conditioning level for the players, the condition of the ice, the building availability. What happens to all the concerts and everything that were all booked? Do they get pushed back? Who gets priority in the buildings? There's a lot of issues to deal with. So,
well, I think it's helpful that they, basically, they have an ice genius and Dan Craig, who has been doing this for so long, going back to the days the Oilers always had the best ice. Around, they had such a great offensive dynamic team. They wanted that ice to be perfect. And, the Oilers back then, I believe Craig was part of all that. And now, of course, he's works with the league and is consults on things. And I'm sure he'll be involved in making sure that whatever needs to be done, because I'm sure there are tricks that people who deal with this kind of thing understand what needs to be done. And it's obviously going to cost more money. Because they'll have to make sure the temperature is right and that requires energy to do all that.
The doors closed and all that kinds of stuff and the humidifiers. Another thing we didn't touch on that I was reading too is a lot of the teams are stepping up now and saying at first everybody was going to get paid as normal. Now they're cutting the salaries back by 25%. Even at the league office, right? They're cutting. Right.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because no one wants to. Well, I shouldn't say no one, because we've had in the political arena yesterday, we had the Lieutenant Governor in Texas, basically talk about this very issue. But, if you're the NBA or Major League Baseball or the NHL, you don't want to start talking about this crisis in terms of the economic hardship of it all. Yeah. But now I was was flabbergasted to now read and understand. And it made sense. I just didn't think it through. My thought was as well, we were toward the end of the regular season, so the NHL had gotten most of the revenue, but that doesn't take into account, obviously that the playoff revenue is, all part of it as well. I almost looked at that as two separate things. And now they're projecting that, it'd be a loss if we can't play of more than $1 billion.
Oh, is that what it was? Wow.
Yeah, it's more than $1 billion. So now what we're talking about is 1/5 of their budget. So, as Tom has pointed out, as a former player and as an agent, they being the players and the owners, will share in this misery equally because it's a 50-50 split. So now I think we all have a greater understanding that, not only do they want to play and award a cup because, we all want to see sports and that's the way it goes. But, this, I don't want to call it catastrophic because, but this will cause some economic hardship on everybody if they can't play this season.
Absolutely.
And I think there's, that's why, they're doing things like, well, let's look at the schedule and see, what we can do. Can we play in August? And, no matter if they lose any kind of money, what it's going to do is play with the one thing that players hate, which is escrow.
Escrow. Ooh,
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's going to end up, costing that. And, already you're starting to hear things like, what are those called? Those buyouts that we have at the I'm losing my memory here on these kind of things. Anyway, when we went to the salary cap, teams had buyouts that they could use to compliance buyouts. That's compliance buyout. If the cap is going to go down because we've lost revenue, some teams, there may not be enough money for everyone to deal with, and we could end up seeing something like that, Tom, where there'd have to be an agreement.
So you look at some of those teams now that have signed a lot of look at the Toronto Maple Leafs, for example, signing Marner and Austin Matthews and all those guys. So going forward, they're up closer to the cap. So if the cap drops from 82 or 83 range, so if it drops to listen, who knows? It could drop if it's 1/5 that they're going to lose potentially this year. Let's say it's 1/5 next year, so the cap drops to bring it down to 60 or something like that, or 65 million. Yeah. I mean, you've got to start getting rid of players, or do they say? Or do they come up with the Players Association and the league come up with some arrangement where they say, okay, if it's dropping by 1/5, then each player's contract is reduced by 1/5 for that year. So
I guess what we're saying is there's a little bit of uncertainty of how this would work, and who knows how much they'd really lose. Like, this could end up being the greatest playoffs of all time in terms of, if we get back, because everyone. Maybe sponsorship would go up. Maybe there's some bonuses for ratings and people would be watching it because they miss it. Who knows? Yeah. But, these questions are all going to be wrapped up into this when this decision is made, and they're going to have to sort that all out. But, the Players Association, the one thing I will say is that I think over time, the Players Association, in the early years, Players Association needed to be and was militant because they were not treated fairly for so many years in terms of their percentage of the revenue. I mean, they're the product. Mm-hmm. And now over time, as we've reached this 50-50 split, and there have been some givebacks from the players in recent years. But I do think there is, with Donald Fehr in charge, and with the sort of understanding of the history of what's happening, there is an ability to sort of work together and compromise and get it done. We didn't have that in the early years, and to be fair, we probably couldn't have had it because the players needed to draw a line in the sand at early on to make sure they got their fair share. I mean, look how much the contracts have escalated, Tom, since your era.
Incredible. Well, when I retired in 1991 or whatever it was, I think my salary was $300,000, and that was a pretty good salary. I was pretty good defenseman at that point. But it's funny, you talk about that, and a little history lesson for everybody listening out there. So when Bob Goodenow took over in it was like 91, right around when I was retired.
Yeah, right around there. Yeah.
So at that point, if you go back to 1986, we started to have discussions about salary disclosure. We did not have salary disclosure. It's funny thinking about that now. So I didn't know what anybody else in the league was making, and nobody else knew it. We just didn't discuss it. It was something that wasn't part of our collective bargaining agreement. And Alan Eagleson, who ultimately went to jail, was the head of our Players Association, didn't want us, he argued against having salary disclosure. Finally, in 1992, they had salary disclosure. And now, listen, Bob Goodenow, I think you and I feel the same way about him. I didn't agree with a lot of things he did all the time, but he did a lot of good things for the players.
Yeah, for sure.
Organizing and salary started to go up at that point. I think, where was I going with that? Oh, the militant part. So I think Bob knew, it's his credit, and he told us several times leading up to the lockout in 04-05, he would tell us at our agent meetings, this could last 2 years. He really believed that. And I think if you saw what happened during that process of bargaining, that collective bargaining agreement, it was going to head to 2 years if the players hadn't really kind of pushed Bob aside and got a settlement done. But I think what Bob was doing at that time, he was so militant because he knew the players in the past, like us, who we couldn't grasp that, yes, it's stupid. We should have salary disclosure. We argued about it. We never should argue about it. He knew how players were at that point. He knew he now needed to flip the switch and get these guys to be militant. And he needed to make sure the owners knew that. So when he was telling us publicly in a meeting of 150 agents, he knew that message was going to go back to the owners. And now, then trying to build this thing, listen, this is not going to be easy. This is going to be a long, dragged out affair. And that's what it became, ultimately missing one season. And you're right. So now there was no cap at that point. We ultimately gave into the cap. Now we've gone again. It's now down to 50-50. But it's a good system, right? The cap is now at $80+ million, depending on what happens here with the virus. So you're right. Donald Fehr rightfully so realizes he doesn't need to have that militant group anymore. It's a 50-50 split. So it's more working together to build the pie so that everybody is happy.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be vigilant if you're the Players Association, and I think they are. I mean, Donald Fehr is, his reputation before he got to the NHL was built on his work, in Major League Baseball, and he's a very bright, articulate lawyer.
Yes.
So they know what they're doing. Going back to Bob Goodenow, I thought the best description I ever heard from him came, and I won't tell you which agent it was, but it came from an agent who said that Bob Goodenow was a great wartime general, but a horrible peacetime general.
Yes.
And, when they needed the war, he drew his saber and led the charge.
Yep.
But, the problem is at some point you have to lay the saber down.
Yeah.
And that's where Bob had difficulty. I mean, think about General George Patton, who was, a terrific American general. But, when the war was over, he didn't want to make peace with the Russians. He didn't want to. And that's the sense I think people had about Bob. Yeah. He wanted to continue to fight. And, who knows? I mean, maybe they needed to still fight. I don't want to have judgment on that. But I think it's we see with coaches, maybe Players Association directors have shelf lives too.
Yeah.
And they needed Bob early on.
Yes.
Because, just think about how ludicrous is now that Alan Eagleson did not favor salary disclosure because that promotes, salary growth. And everybody sort of knew that. And, he didn't favor it. So Bob did a lot of good things for the players. I mean, whenever he got involved, salaries started to escalate dramatically. I remember he was, Brett Hull's agent, and he ended up getting a big contract for Hull out of St. Louis. This is before it was in the Players Association, and it was considered a big contract because you know how it works. When one great player gets a great contract, then everybody says, "Okay, that's the starting point. That's where I want to go."
Yeah.
And Bob understood that.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I agree with your assessment of Bob totally. You know, I think I won't speak for you, but I think you feel the same way. On a personal level, I didn't like the way Bob carried himself.
yeah,
But the way he fought for the players, and you said it very well. At a time, he was perfect. At that time, they needed somebody to fight for them, not to give in, not to be buddies and pals like Eagleson was. So if everybody understands, Alan Eagleson was the head of the Players Association, and he also represented some players. He put together Team Canada tournaments, all like he had a lot of control. He would come into the locker rooms back then when I was there. So I started in 1980, and I think he got fired, I guess, close to like 87, 80, 89, something in that range. He was let go. Or it must have been late. It was late 80s. And so Bob came in after that. But Eagleson would come in and he'd always bring in some big name player like a Tony Esposito or something like that. And he would make his spiel, give us a State of the Union. And most guys would just sit there. Now, if you ever chose to speak up and ask for anything, whether it's some verification of what the numbers were or anything, he would attack you. Like he would embarrass you. Like he'd go, like Laidlaw, you're like the sixth defenseman here. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say and all this kind of stuff. So everybody else in those days kind of would say, I don't want to get singled out like that again and embarrassed. So nobody would ask any questions. It was in '86, and John Van Beesbroek was on the Rangers when I was there. And he was Eagleson was coming in to talk to us. And we had a meeting beforehand saying, okay, we need to ask some questions here, guys. And we brought up the subject. Yeah, but when we do, he just rips us and everybody's embarrassed and doesn't want to say anything. So to Beezer's credit, he said, okay, Tommy, you're going to be the spokesperson. And if Alan does that to you, I'm going to back you up. Now, John and I, we have great teammates, but it wasn't like we were best buddies or something like that. It wasn't like we were really tight. So he stepped up at that time. So we have the meeting with Eagleson. I questioned him on, I think it was the issue of salary disclosure. He had given us some numbers that the league was going to go under if the salaries went up any higher. And asked the question now right away. Eagleson jumped all over me like, Tommy, what are you doing? Come on, nobody wants to hear what you have to say. And John Van Beesbroek, to his credit, said, no, Tommy is our spokesperson. You need to listen to what he has to say. And man, it was amazing. The room just got dead quiet. Alan just shut up because that had never happened to before. To our record, certainly not in our meetings, that had never happened before. And he really changed his tune. He said, okay, I'll get you the numbers. And I think that wasn't the start of his demise, but I think guys were starting to catch on to what his games were, and things were starting to change.
Yeah. Well, using the coaching analogy again too, oftentimes if you have a player's coach, the next guy that comes in has to be, and it doesn't work, then you have to have a guy who's hard on him. And I think in hindsight, Eagleson was too friendly with ownership.
Yes, totally.
And so they wanted a guy who would never be friendly with ownership. Yeah. And that was Bob. And I remember him well. Like he did a really good job. When I think about him, I think about being in Joe Louis Arena, and you'd see him after a game, and he'd have, Bob didn't just court the stars. Like third and fourth liners, he would get to know them all. He'd be leaning against the wall there with his arms folded, and he'd be in this deep conversation with, the third line winger of the Montreal Canadiens. And, he knew everybody's stats. Like he really did a good job of bringing the Players Association together. And, it did fall apart there at the end, but I think it had to kind of fall apart because that's what happens in war. There was a war, and when it was over, people were tired of the war, and they didn't want that they wanted to make peace. And I don't know that Bob was ready to do that.
Well, I think, to me, his miscalculation, like I said before, he made no bones about it. This lockout could last 2 years. And I think where he miscalculated was thinking that an NHL player that has dreamed all his life to getting to the National Hockey League, set aside the money value, if most guys play, let's say 9 or 10 years, which is kind of the average for the guys that get in and establish themselves as players, they are now going to take 2 years of those 10 years, 1/5 of your career, and sit around and not play for ultimately a cap that was going to happen anyways. Most people really believe that the cap was going to happen. We could fight it all we want, but every other sport was having a cap. These owners had banded together; they were going to get a cap. So I think that's where he miscalculated. And once we got to the end of the first season, we missed because of the lockout. I think players saw that And I did too. As much as I had heard Bob's words say that this could take 2 years, I was sitting there going, "Nah, come on, it's not going to happen." Now the first season we missed finally happens. I'm thinking, wow, he said it. There's no, like, you got to give Bob credit. It wasn't like he was hiding some facts or misleading us. He said 2 years. Now we're heading for the second year of a lockout, and that's when everybody got together and just said, just can't happen anymore. So
yeah, and he was a ferocious. You hear the stories with him, and he could get irate.
Yeah,
to say the
he
least.
got irate intentionally too sometimes.
Oh, for sure. So a lot of it was calculated.
Yeah, if you didn't do a good enough no matter what unless you got just an unbelievable contract for a player, as an agent, you could just about be guaranteed that after you're done the contract, he was going to call, or one of his guys working for him. And it's funny because Mike Liu, who was a former player who I knew well, we played against each other in college, played against each other in the NHL, both now working on the player side. He was working for the Players Association at one point. I can't remember who I did a contract for. He called me up and he was kind of like apologetic. He was great. He was really good about it. He says, "You know why I'm calling? I have to do it." And then he says, "Okay, now you should have got this and should have got that." And we both kind of laughed a little bit. I said, "Okay, message sent," and we moved on. And it was, you can tell what Bob was doing. He was wanting to kind of make it so that when you're an agent, you're thinking to yourself, "Oh God, I don't want to get another one of those phone calls, so I better squeeze for more money." I mean, it never worked with me. I was going to do what was right for the player, no matter what. But Bob was good.
What's interesting about Bob was, I thought he was altruistic in terms of he really wanted what was best for all the players.
Yeah.
He just didn't have any way of toning down his harsh ways. All he wanted to do was to get the most money for everybody and to make it better. That was what his objective was, and it was sincere. He really wanted everyone to do better. He just didn't seem to have a way to, sooner or later people get weary of that constantly being, on, and they couldn't deal with that. But I'm not really sure how we ended up talking about Bob on all this. But anyway, just getting back to where we are, I don't know. I would say, and I'm not sure why, maybe it was just this one call with the GMs with the, made it seem like the league is serious about August hockey.
Right.
But I feel a little more optimistic about the possibility of playing. Now, that's not even taking into account what may happen with the virus.
Yep.
But it does seem like the league, and now that I understand the finances more, I do have an understanding better of that as well. Seems pretty sincere about, if at all possible, boy, we're going to try to play.
Right. Yes, listen, right now, like here in New York, where I guess you call it the epicenter of the virus for the United States.
For now.
For now. I know August is now, like 4 or 5 months down the road. But the way we are right now, I just can't even envision 18,000 people packing into Madison Square Garden to watch a game. But that's way down the road. Who knows what happens with it? But that's about. But now, again, is it different? Is it less of a problem in Detroit or Minnesota or other places where people don't feel that way? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I know. How much are you really sheltering in place? I mean, how much are you going out? Tell me what you're doing.
So my sons live very close to me. My son actually lives one son lives in the same complex as me. My younger son lives about 5 miles away. For instance, yesterday, my younger son wanted some beets and ginger, which I had here. He's a little bit of he doesn't like germs to start with, so he doesn't really want to go to the stores too much at all. So he came by. I went out to the car. Basically, he opened the window. I basically threw the stuff at him in the window. And when we stood there on top, but we stayed 10 feet away. A lot of people are going out walking where I live. But even when we're walking, if two people are coming at each other on the sidewalk, one person, it's amazing to watch now. One of the two will walk out onto the road. The other person will thank them that, somebody's got to get away from each other. So people are really doing a good job of it. That's 6-10 feet away. You go into stores, the stores like at gas stations, they'll have signs up front, please, practice social distancing. So if you're in line with somebody, most people will be, and I think a lot of people are giving them dirty looks if they don't do it. They'll stay 6 to 10 feet behind that other person in front of them. Some people will wait outside before they're done. So the social distancing thing, I think since a lot of those college kids were down in Florida on spring break, it took a lot of heat for it, made it all over the papers. especially around here, I think most people are rightfully so taking the attitude, listen, I am healthy. I don't believe that I will catch the virus, but I need to think about the fact that I may be a carrier, and who am I taking it to somebody else? And I think I see most people, the vast majority of people thinking that way right now.
Yeah. I think I'm the same way. I've been to the store twice since all this started a couple of weeks ago, and I was very careful when I went, and tried to get enough that I won't have to go to the store very often. And
well, you can't cook really that well, anyways, right? I mean,
oh no, I can cook, but my wife's home now, so when we're together, she ends up doing the most. When I was
the picture I sent you, the omelet I made.
Yeah, well, I don't doubt you're a better cook than me. I would say that I would have put myself against you early on.
Right.
In the early years, I did a lot of the cooking
Okay.
when my wife and I were first married. But over time, with my job, I started to travel, and she ended up becoming a great cook. So she's a much better cook. So but I'm self-sufficient. Like
Okay.
if my wife is gone, I know how to cook things and so forth. But I don't doubt that you're a better cook.
I've changed my way of making omelets. That was a different omelet for me. Usually I put all the mixings, the vegetables and everything in the pan with the egg, and then get it all cooked together, and then do the whole flip technique, and then fold it over. I was watching a cooking shows, which shows what I'm doing with my life right now, where they showed how you make all the veggies and everything in one pan, cook your egg, and then put the vegetables on one side, and then flip the egg over.
Right.
Look,
That's how I would do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Even had the avocado on the whole grain toast and everything too. Pretty impressive.
Yeah. I like avocado. I'm not sure I'd want it on toast, but
it is at first. You maybe don't think it's that good, but it gets going. It's good.
Yeah. Now, do you do you use jelly at all? The all fruit jelly, or none of that?
What? It's got sugar in it.
So you don't do fruit at all, natural sugar?
Well, I try to limit it. So what I have my juice shot in the morning where I have ginger, turmeric, beets, and cucumber. Sometimes I put a half of a Granny Smith apple in with that.
Oh, you do apples. Okay.
Yeah, sometimes I try. The ginger, as much as there's a lot of health benefits for it, it's got a bite to it. So sometimes you try to put a little something in there to make it a little bit more enjoyable.
Now, is the apple the only fruit you'll touch?
Pretty much. Once in a while an orange, but yeah. Usually I have stuff in the freezer to make smoothies where it's frozen blueberries and frozen pineapple. So you can make a healthy smoothie, you put coconut water in there. And I've learned now I've gotten better. Like I've had chia seeds and I've used them in the past, but I've learned that you need to soak your chia seeds. Then they soften up and are better in smoothies and everything. You don't get that granular taste to it. So we do have some, try to stay away too much from having, like I wouldn't have a smoothie every day that had blueberries and pineapples in it.
Yeah. No, I know a lot of the people don't even, it's funny because, your doctors are always pushing you to eat more fruits. And, but now all the, the people that are clean living, they don't do very much fruit, if any at all. So
a lot more, like I'm really learning more about the turmeric and the ginger and stuff like that, the anti-inflammatory stuff. The chia seeds are great for a source of fiber and low carb and all that kind of stuff. So,
all right, well, we've moved into the health food portion of our show, and we've taken it beyond the limit on that. So we'll call it a show today. This has been the Laidlaw and Allen Report. I'm Alan. He's Laidlaw. We'll be back next week.
See you next week, guys.